In architecture, every structure has a failure point. For Mia Collins, it wasn't a beam or a foundation. It was the sound of a heavy boot scraping against damp brick. Mia pressed her back against the dumpster, the red neon sign above the alley painting her skin in the color of a warning. Her breathing was shallow, hitched, the air tasting of rain and rusted metal. She pulled out her phone. The screen was a spiderweb of cracks, but the words were clear. Help me. He's killing me. With a trembling thumb, she hit send. She didn't know that a single-digit error had just changed the trajectory of her death. 3 miles away, in a penthouse bathed in the cold, detached blue of a midnight skyline, a phone vibrated. It sat on a mahogany desk belonging to Matteo DeLuca, the man they called the Shadow King. It was a phone that hadn't lit up in 5 years, a ghost phone. Matteo stared at the message. He didn't know Mia Collins. He didn't know about the corrupt official closing in on her with a silenced pistol. But Matteo knew one thing. Someone had just reached into the land of the dead to ask for a miracle, and the Shadow King was the only devil who could provide it. The architectural firm of Miller and Associates was supposed to be Mia Collins's sanctuary, a place where lines were straight and structures were sound. But she had spent the last 6 months discovering that the foundations of Chicago were built on rot. It started with a discrepancy in the blueprints for the new waterfront district. As the lead structural consultant, Mia had flagged a series of fatal flaws in the foundation, shortcuts that would save millions in construction costs, but would inevitably lead to a collapse within a decade. When she brought the report to Thomas Sterling, the city's commissioner of development, she expected a thank you. Instead, she received a cold, lingering stare that made her skin crawl. Sterling wasn't just a bureaucrat. He was a man who viewed the city as his personal ledger. He had deep ties to the unions and deeper ones to the contractors who were pocketing the savings from the faulty foundations. Mia's report wasn't just a correction. It was a threat to a multi-million-dollar kickback scheme. "You're a very talented woman, Mia," Sterling had whispered, leaning over her desk 2 nights ago. "But even the most beautiful buildings can be demolished if they're standing in the way of progress. Forget the report, or you'll find out how easily things disappear in this city." Mia didn't forget. She tried to go to the authorities, only to find that Sterling's reach extended into the very precinct where she sought help. Within 48 hours, her apartment had been tossed, her bank accounts were frozen on suspicion of fraud, and a black sedan began following her every move. She was being erased. The situation turned lethal tonight. Sterling had cornered her at an industry gala, his hand gripping her arm with bruising force. "I gave you a choice, Mia. Now, I have to ensure the structural integrity of my reputation." She had bolted, losing her shoes as she sprinted into the rain-slicked labyrinth of the West Loop. Sterling wasn't far behind, and he wasn't alone. He had traded his suit jacket for a heavy coat, and the legitimate official now held a weapon with a professional ease that suggested this wasn't his first demolition. Now, trapped in an alleyway that felt like a tomb of brick and mortar, Mia realized her mistake. She had tried to play by the rules in a game where the referee was the one trying to kill her. She pressed her back against the damp brick, her breath coming in ragged hitches. Her phone vibrated, a final warning. A text from an unknown number, Sterling's number. "Nowhere left to hide, Mia. Every exit is closed." With trembling fingers and eyes blurred by rain and terror, she opened her messaging app. She didn't have much time. She needed to reach her brother, the only person with the encryption key to the cloud drive where she'd hidden the original report. She typed the message with frantic speed. "Help me. He's killing me." Her thumb, slick with rain and a small cut from her scramble over a chain-link fence, slipped as she pressed send. She saw the number for a fleeting second, 1 digit off. A 7 instead of a 1. In the distance, the heavy click of Sterling's shoes grew louder. Mia closed her eyes, clutching the cracked phone to her chest, unaware that her stray digit had just bypassed the city's corrupt systems entirely and landed directly in the hands of the only man Thomas Sterling truly feared. The heavy, rhythmic click of Thomas Sterling's shoes stopped at the mouth of the alley. The silence that followed was far more terrifying than the pursuit. Mia pressed her forehead against the cold brick, her lungs burning with the effort of remaining silent. Through the gap between the dumpster and the wall, she saw him, the respectable commissioner, now a silhouette of pure malice, silencer-equipped pistol leveled at the shadows. "I can hear your heart beating, Mia," Sterling whispered, his voice echoing with a sickening intimacy. "It's a structural flaw. Too much noise." He stepped forward, the puddle beneath his boot rippling in the dim red light. Mia squeezed her eyes shut, clutching her phone like a talisman, waiting for the inevitable. But the shot never came. Instead, the atmosphere in the alley shifted. The temperature seemed to drop, and the ambient noise of the city, the distant sirens, the hum of traffic, was swallowed by a sudden, oppressive vacuum. From the darkness behind Sterling, a car appeared. It didn't roar. It glided like a predatory shark through black water. A sleek, armored sedan cut across the mouth of the alley, blocking Sterling's only exit. Sterling spun around, his professional composure fracturing. "Who the hell is that?" "This is a restricted area." The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out into the intersection of the red neon and the car's cold white headlights. Matteo DeLuca didn't look like a hero. He looked like the personification of the dark end of the street. His dark suit was immaculate, his expression a mask of bored, lethal indifference. "You're making a lot of noise for a man who values his reputation," Matteo said. His voice was a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very bricks Mia leaned against. "DeLuca," Sterling hissed, the name coming out as a gasp of recognition and pure terror. "This doesn't concern the outfit. This is city business." Matteo didn't argue. He didn't even draw a weapon. He simply walked forward, each step possessing a gravity that made Sterling's earlier arrogance look like a child's tantrum. When Sterling raised his gun, Matteo didn't flinch. With a movement too fast for Mia's eyes to track, Matteo caught Sterling's wrist. The sound of bone grinding against bone filled the alley, a dry, sickening crunch. The commissioner dropped to his knees, his scream muffled by Matteo's gloved hand. The pistol clattered to the wet pavement. "You sent a message to a number that belongs to me," Matteo whispered, leaning down so his face was inches from the officials. "That makes her my business. And I don't like people touching my things." Matteo didn't look at the broken man as he collapsed. He turned his gaze toward the shadows where Mia hid. For a heartbeat, she feared him more than she had feared Sterling. But as he reached out a hand, his fingers steady and strong in the cold blue light, the Shadow King didn't look like a monster. He looked like the only solid thing in a world that had just collapsed. "Mia Collins," he said, and it wasn't a question. "The exits are no longer closed. Let's go." The transition from the rain-slicked concrete of the alley to the silence of the DeLuca estate felt less like a rescue and more like a descent into another dimension. When Mia finally opened her eyes, the first thing she saw wasn't the peeling wallpaper of her apartment or the sterile white of a hospital room. It was a ceiling of hand-painted fresco, framed by crown molding so intricate it looked like lace carved from bone. The air here didn't smell like wet pavement or fear. It smelled of sandalwood, old paper, and the sharp, metallic tang of expensive floor wax. Mia tried to sit up, but a sharp spike of pain in her side anchored her to the bed. The sheets beneath her were silk, a cool emerald green that felt like water against her bruised skin. "Don't move," a voice commanded from the shadows. "The doctor said your ribs are hairline fractured. If you shift too quickly, you'll regret it." Matteo DeLuca sat in a high-backed leather chair near the window, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the moonlit Chicago skyline. He had traded his suit jacket for a charcoal sweater, the sleeves pushed back to reveal forearms corded with muscle and history. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at her phone, which sat on the marble nightstand between them. It had been cleaned, the blood wiped away, though the cracks in the screen remained like a map of her near-death experience. "Where am I?" Mia managed to whisper, her voice sounding thin and ragged in the vast room. "In a place where Thomas Sterling cannot go," Matteo replied, finally turning his head. The blue light of the city hit his eyes, making them look like cold glass. He spent the last 3 hours calling every precinct in the city, reporting a kidnapping. He thinks he can use the law to get you back. A cold shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature swept over Mia. He'll find me. He has the badges. He has the city. He has the surface, Matteo corrected, standing up and walking toward the bed with a slow, predatory grace. But he doesn't have the shadows. In this house, the law is a suggestion I choose to ignore. He stopped at the edge of her reach. For the first time, Mia noticed the sheer scale of her new environment. The room was a fortress of marble and silk, beautiful but imposing. She realized then that she hadn't been taken to a sanctuary. She had been brought to a throne room. Sterling had wanted to kill her to protect a secret, but Matteo DeLuca had claimed her for a reason she didn't yet understand. "You saved me," she said, searching his face for a flicker of warmth, finding only the terrifying responsibility of a king. "I answered a message," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "But understand this, Mia Collins. You are no longer a citizen of the city. You are a guest of the DeLuca family. The predator in the alley is gone, but you are now in the den of a much larger animal. Sleep. Tomorrow, we discuss what you're going to owe me for your life." The days that followed were a blur of high thread count linens and the rhythmic, clinical ticking of a grandfather clock that stood like a sentry in the hall. As the fog of painkillers lifted, Mia's mind, trained to see the world in vectors and load-bearing points, began to itch. She was an architect. She couldn't help but deconstruct the space around her. Her room was a masterpiece of old-world security, thick limestone walls and heavy oak doors. But as she took her first tentative steps toward the balcony, she began to see the cracks in the Shadow King's armor. To a mobster, security was about men with guns and iron gates. To an architect, security was about flow, sightlines, and structural vulnerabilities. Leaning against the cold marble railing of the terrace, Mia looked down at the sprawling estate. She saw the guards pacing the perimeter, their shadows long under the security lights. They were focused on the gates, but they ignored the blind spot created by the cantilevered terrace of the West Wing. The way the shadows pooled near the servants' entrance wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was a structural invitation for an intruder. "You should be resting," a voice rumbled. Mia didn't startle. She had grown used to the way Matteo DeLuca moved, like smoke in a dark room. He stood in the doorway, watching her with that same guarded intensity. "Your foundation is sinking, Matteo," she said, her voice stronger than it had been days ago. He raised an eyebrow, stepping onto the balcony. The blue light of the moon caught the sharp angles of his face. "This house has stood for 80 years. It isn't sinking." "Not the stone," Mia said, gesturing toward the dark perimeter. "The strategy. You've built a fortress based on muscle, but you've ignored the geometry of the land. That retaining wall on the north side, it creates a sound shadow. Someone could blow the gate, and your men in the West Wing wouldn't hear it until the glass started breaking." Matteo walked to the railing, looking out over his domain. He remained silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the points she had indicated. For a man who lived by control, the idea of a blind spot was a direct insult. "And the terrace?" he asked, his voice low. "It's a ladder," she replied simply. "A trained climber wouldn't even need a rope. They'd be in your bedroom before your guards finished their cigarette break." Matteo turned to look at her, and for the first time, the Shadow King looked at her not as a debt to be collected or a victim to be shielded, but as an asset. The power dynamic shifted in the silence between them. He realized then that Mia Collins didn't just see buildings. She saw the weaknesses within them. "Show me," he commanded, his eyes darkening with a new kind of interest. "Show me every way my world can be broken." The map of the estate lay between them on the mahogany desk, a ghost of blue ink and white lines, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted from clinical observation to something heavy and ancestral. Matteo stared at the layout, but his eyes were fixed on a point far beyond the walls of the study. He reached into the velvet-lined drawer and pulled out the cracked burner phone, the one Mia had accidentally summoned him with. "You asked me why I came," Matteo said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to pull the very air from the room. "Why a man like me would burn half the city down for a wrong number." Mia watched him, her hand resting near a blueprint of the north gate. The Shadow King usually stood as an unmovable monolith, but as he held the phone, his shoulders carried a weight that no amount of power could lift. "That phone belonged to my sister, Elena," he said, and the name sounded like a prayer and a curse. 5 years ago, she was where you were. Trapped. Hunted by someone who wore a uniform and a smile. She sent me a message, the last one she ever wrote. But I was in a meeting. I was handling business. I didn't see it until 3 hours too late. He set the phone down on the desk. The blue light of the office reflected in the spiderweb cracks of the screen, mirroring the ones on Mia's own device. I spent years keeping that line active, paying the bill every month like a fool, waiting for a ghost to tell me she was okay. When it vibrated in that alley, it wasn't just a text, Mia. It was a second chance from a god I don't believe in. Mia felt a sharp pull in her chest that had nothing to do with her fractured ribs. She saw the tether now, a blood-soaked line connecting her survival to his grief. He hadn't just saved her from Sterling. He was trying to save a girl who had been buried for half a decade. "I'm not a ghost, Matteo," she whispered, stepping closer until she could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes. "No," he replied, his gaze snapping to hers, hard and unrelenting. "You're the living proof that I can still stop the monsters who think they're untouchable. Sterling isn't just a corrupt official anymore. To me, he is the man who didn't get caught 5 years ago. And I am going to ensure that this time, the story ends differently." He reached out, his thumb grazing the edge of the blueprint she had marked. The debt of blood was no longer a metaphor. It was a pact. Mia realized then that she wasn't just an architect or a guest. She was the catalyst for a king's long-delayed vengeance. The peace of the DeLuca estate didn't break with a gunshot. It broke with the shrill, synchronized wail of sirens. From the high windows of the study, Mia watched as a caravan of blue and red lights snaked up the private drive, cutting through the morning mist like a serrated blade. This wasn't a tactical strike by a rival gang. This was the full weight of the city's legitimate power. Thomas Sterling had stopped hiding in the shadows. He had realized that to get to Mia, he didn't need a silencer. He needed a warrant. "They're citing a structural emergency," Matteo said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration as he stepped up behind her. He held a tablet displaying the digital feed from the front gate. Sterling pushed through an emergency condemnation order. Toxic waste, fire hazards, building code violations, pick your poison. He's using the Department of Buildings as his personal infantry. Mia felt the old, cold dread clawing at her throat. She knew how Sterling worked. He wouldn't just knock, he would dismantle. "He's not here for the house, Matteo. He's here to create a legal vacuum. If your men fire on city officials, you're not a businessman anymore. You're a domestic terrorist. He's forcing you to choose between giving me up or starting a war with the state." Outside, a loudspeaker crackled to life, the distorted voice of a police captain demanding entry for a mandatory inspection. Behind the front line of squad cars, Mia spotted Sterling. He was standing near a black SUV, adjusting his tie, looking every bit the concerned public servant while his eyes searched the windows for her. "He thinks he's playing a game of chess," Matteo whispered, his hand coming to rest on the small of Mia's back. The touch was grounding, a sharp contrast to the chaos brewing at the gates. "He thinks because he wears a tie, I have to follow his rules." "You can't fight the city, Matteo," Mia said, her eyes fixed on the heavy machinery Sterling had brought along, a wrecking crew disguised as a safety team. "He'll tear this place down brick by brick just to find the files I have." Matteo turned away from the window, his expression settling into a mask of lethal calm. He didn't look worried. He looked like a man who had just been given permission to stop being polite. "Let him try to dismantle my foundation," Matteo said, reaching for the internal comms. "He's about to find out that the city doesn't end where the pavement stops. If he wants to use his resources, I'll use mine. We're going dark, Mia. Tell your heart to stop racing. The law is only a threat to those who believe in it." As the first heavy ram hit the outer gate, the lights in the estate flickered and died, plunging the fortress into a calculated, predatory darkness. The legal assault had begun, But the Shadow King was no longer playing by the city's rules. The darkness that swallowed the estate was supposed to be Matteo's greatest ally, a tactical shroud designed to turn his home into a labyrinth of shadows. But as the emergency red lights flickered on, a low, mechanical hum began to scream, not of a system shutdown, but of a total override. The heavy blast-proof shutters, designed to seal the west wing, suddenly groaned and began to retract. One by one, the electronic locks on the perimeter doors disengaged with a series of hollow, definitive clicks. "The firewall is down," Matteo hissed, his fingers flying across a backup console that refused to respond. This isn't Sterling's hacks. Someone from the inside just handed him the keys to the kingdom. The betrayal hung in the air, cold and sharp. Matteo's men were suddenly exposed, caught in the open as Sterling's tactical teams breached the courtyard. But while Matteo reached for his weapon, Mia's eyes were fixed on the master architectural display flickering on the wall. She didn't see a security failure. She saw a structural manipulation. "Matteo, look at the sequence," Mia said, her voice cutting through the rising panic of the alarms. She pointed to the flashing sectors on the digital blueprint. "The mole isn't just opening doors. They're funneling your men into the foyer. It's a kill box. They want you to defend the center so they can collapse the perimeter." Matteo paused, his hand on the hilt of his pistol. He looked at the woman he had saved, seeing the way her mind was already reconstructing the battlefield. "If we don't hold the foyer, we lose the house." "No," Mia countered, her architect's intuition firing with a lethal clarity. "If you hold the foyer, you die. We need to use the structural flaws I found. The north retaining wall and the sound shadows. If we move through the service vents in the sub-basement, we can bypass their line of sight and come up behind the breach point." For a heartbeat, the Shadow King hesitated. He was a man who led by force, not by geometry. But as the sound of shattering glass echoed from the floor below, he realized his strength was useless in a house that had turned against him. "Command the layout, Mia," he said, his voice a dark, choosing vow. "I'll be the hand, but you be the eyes. Lead us through the bones of this place." Mia stepped up to the console, her trembling hands suddenly steady. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was an architect of war, rewriting the flow of the building to turn a sanctuary into a trap. As Sterling's men flooded into the empty foyer, Mia guided Matteo into the hidden veins of the estate, using the very blueprints Sterling sought to turn the hunter into the prey. The air in the substructure was thick with the scent of pulverized concrete and the acrid sting of flashbangs. Above them, the estate groaned as Sterling's tactical teams hammered at the reinforced doors of the empty foyer, but in the service corridor, the silence was absolute. A sudden burst of gunfire erupted near the service lift. Matteo grunted, his body jerking as a spray of crimson blossomed against the shoulder of his dark sweater. He didn't scream. He simply leaned his weight against the damp brick wall, his breath hitching in a way that reminded Mia of her own desperate gasps in the alley. "Matteo," she whispered, reaching for him. "Keep moving," he rasped, his hand clutching his side, blood leaking through his fingers. "They're behind us. If they catch us in this bottleneck, it's over." Mia didn't panic. She looked at the narrow, dark artery of the corridor, then up at the ceiling where a series of brass pipes ran toward the north wing. She wasn't seeing a basement. She was seeing the building's circulatory system. "They aren't behind us yet," Mia said, her voice dropping into the clinical tone of a master builder. "They're following the heat signatures in the walls, but they don't know about the secondary ventilation shaft behind the wine cellar. It's a structural ghost. It was removed from the city's filed plans in the 40s. She stepped under Matteo's good arm, taking his weight. He was a pillar of iron, even in his wounded state, but he allowed her to guide him. They moved through a door hidden behind a rack of vintage Bordeaux, entering a space so narrow their shoulders brushed the rough-hewn stone. 20 feet ahead, there's a manual release for the fire suppression system, Mia whispered, her eyes tracking the invisible lines of the estate's skeleton. "If we trigger it here, it won't just spray water. This wing uses a localized halon gas for the archives. It'll drop the oxygen levels to 0 in the foyer within 10 seconds. My men, Matteo started, are already clear, she countered. I saw the light sequence. They retreated to the west wing like I told them. Sterling's team is the only thing left in the kill box. They reached the lever. Mia placed her hand over Matteo's, their fingers interlacing over the cold steel. Through the wall, they could hear the muffled shouts of Sterling's men as they realized the foyer was a trap. On my count, Mia said. She felt the strength in Matteo's hand, the Shadow King, giving himself over to her design. Together, they pulled. A low, thunderous hiss filled the house as the invisible gas flooded the floor above. The screams turned to frantic gasping, then to silence. Matteo slumped against her, his head resting against the stone. In the dim red glow of the emergency lights, he looked at her with a terrifying kind of awe. The architect had turned his home into a weapon, and for the first time, the king realized he wasn't the only one who knew how to rule the dark. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the thick, gray haze of smoke still rising from the estate's ruins. Inside the master study, the silence was no longer heavy with secrets, but with the definitive weight of victory. The halon gas had cleared, and with it, the threat that had chased Mia into that red-lit alley days ago. Thomas Sterling had been led away not by his own officers, but by the federal task force Matteo had quietly summoned using the very files Mia had risked her life to protect. Matteo stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his shoulder bandaged and his arm in a sling, yet he had never looked more like the Shadow King. He stared out at the Chicago skyline, the blue light of the dawn reflecting in his eyes. He heard the soft click of Mia's heels on the marble, a steady, confident sound that no longer carried the frantic rhythm of a victim. She stepped up beside him, her reflection ghosting against the glass. She wasn't the trembling architect who had mistyped a digit in the dark. She was the woman who had rewritten the geometry of a fortress to trap a wolf. The city looks different from up here, Mia whispered, leaning her shoulder against his. Less like a trap and more like a blueprint. Matteo turned his head, his gaze softening as it landed on her. For the first time, he didn't see the ghost of his sister in the room. He saw a partner. He reached out with his steady hand, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw before resting at the back of her neck. It was a gesture of absolute possession, but also absolute respect. Sterling thought he could break you because he understood the law, Matteo said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. He didn't realize that you understand how things are built, and how they fall. I'm done building for men like him, Mia replied, her eyes fixed on the horizon. I want to build something that lasts. Something that even the shadows can't touch. Matteo smiled, a slow, dangerous expression that promised a new kind of order for the city below. He looked at the burner phone sitting on the desk, silent now, its purpose fulfilled. The debt of blood had been paid in full, and in its place, something far more formidable had been forged. Then we do it together, he vowed. I'll handle the monsters, and you'll design the kingdom. They stood in silence as the sun finally broke through the clouds, bathing the room in a crown of gold. The hunt was over, the wrong number had led to the right destination, and a new reign was beginning. The city belonged to the people who knew its secrets, and as the Shadow King and his architect looked out over their domain, they knew the world would never be the same. Long live the king and queen.